Some viewers may find the following video disturbing. Viewer discretion is advised.
Welcome, everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Pied Piper of Pasadena. Today is the story of Dean Coral. Now, before we get started with our story, as we normally talk here in our discussions in these series, if you're tuning in, we normally discuss stories of crime and murder in nature. But because of the subject matter that this story entails, I thought it would be important to, before we begin, if you are sensitive to materials of SA, or dealing with stories of SA, or SA with children, then I highly advise that viewer discretion is greatly advised. I would have to say, out of all the stories that I've covered, this one I would have to find to be the most disturbing. So without further ado, let's get into our story. Part 1. Storage Shed Number 11. On August 8, 1973, Houston Police Department would arrive at Southwest Storage Shed, and they would come across a bunch of L-shaped boat storage sheds, and they would arrive at storage shed number 11 as they had been directed. Elmer Henley, who had actually taken the police to storage shed number 11, would guide them up to the front to where they would find a padlock locking in the door to storage shed number 11. So the detectives would turn around, walk down the road to the house of the person who owned the property, and would begin knocking on the door. When a woman opened the door, Mamie Mariner, she would ask the police what they were there for, and they would reply and tell her that they needed to get into storage shed number 11, and would ask if she could confiscate or retrieve the keys to that shed. Mamie would also reply to the police that that padlock was specifically bought by the person renting the shed, and that she did not have the keys for it. The police would then ask if they had permission to cut the lock with bolt cutters so they can investigate the shed, and Mamie did not reject their request. So the police would go down to storage shed number 11, and they would take some bolt cutters and open the storage shed. And there they would close the area off, and more squad cars would arrive, and more detectives would arrive, and Elmer Henley would guide them into storage shed number 11. Henley, who was only 17 years old, would walk into the dark storage shed, and one detective would later recall and say that just his demeanor, he would turn into a ghostly pale white and would just be visibly sick. And the detective said at that moment he knew there was something inside that shed. Henley would lead the police and the detectives inside the shed, and the windowless shed, which was visibly dark, they would have to wait for their eyes to adjust to the darkness. As their eyes adjusted, then they flashed their flashlight. They had noticed that there were various things strung about in the storage shed, very neatly packed cardboard boxes. There was also a large number of large barrels specifically used for emergency drinking water. There was a few bicycles, some various tools strung about, and a stripped down 1971 Chevrolet Camaro, which they would later find out was an actually stolen Camaro. They would also find a fairly new yellow bicycle, and around it would be 2 10-pound bags of lime. The police would check the serial number of the yellow bicycle and would find out that the bicycle belonged to a 13-year-old James Dramala, who both had gone missing 5 days prior. The police would begin opening the cardboard boxes, and there they had realized that most of the cardboard boxes held clothing, shirts, pants, underwear, varying in sizes from small to medium, but Even more disturbing was the clothes did not belong to any adults, only varying to very young children from ages 12 and teenagers up to ages 17. The police had decided they had seen enough that they knew that they needed to dig and find whatever was inside the shed. So the police would motion over and actually bring 2 prison inmates into the shed. Around that point in time, police and detectives could actually use inmates as a form of slave labor to do manual labor around certain cases. And in this case, they needed all the help they could get. They picked one spot and began digging, and it wasn't long until they started seeing a very thin layer of lime. They had actually dug about 6 inches, and there they had uncovered a skull. And after they uncovered the skull, the smell of decaying flesh could fill the shed. It was actually so thick that one of the inmates actually jumped out of the hole that they were digging and ran outside and began vomiting. After he had ran out, a police officer went in to help them re-dig it up, and shortly after unearthing the skull, they would actually unearth the torso of that body. By the dental records and the blonde hair, they learned that the body that they first uncovered was 13-year-old James Dramala, who had just recently went missing 5 days prior and had actually been seen riding his yellow bicycle in the suburbs of Pasadena. They would say that James Dramala's face had been bound and gagged. A cloth had been shoved down the boy's mouth and a tape wrapped around his face and head. And they would also find wire around his neck, which would prove that he had died by asphyxiation. Not long after they unearthed James Dramala's corpse, they would dig a little bit further and find a second corpse. And this one was actually a little bit more decomposed than the first one, and it was basically skeleton. It was at this point the police knew it was going to be a long night. Police knew that this was not going to be no simple task, so they drove back to the prison to retrieve more spotlights and more inmates to help dig. When they returned, they would pick another spot to dig and look for more bodies. And this specific spot that they had pointed out and started digging, would dig about 8 inches and then find another thin layer of lime. As they dug down deeper, they would find 2 more bodies, both of them teenagers, both of them gagged. One of the teenagers had been shot in the head by a small caliber rifle, more than likely a .22. The other one had a gag around his mouth, and his lips and his teeth were protruding out of the gag, which would prove that at the moment of death, he was basically screaming to death and had died not only by asphyxiation, but by some dark, twisted form of torture. By 10:00 p.m., everyone in the shed would actually have a handkerchief on their mouths to kind of block out the smell of rot. They would begin digging near the back, and there they would unearth 4 more bodies, but in a more advanced form of decomposition. They would eventually call it a night, and their count at this point in time would be 8 bodies. For the bodies that weren't very advanced decomposition, the police were very disturbed by what they had seen. All of the victims had their pubic hair forcibly ripped off. Their genitals had been chewed on or mutilated. Some would have very large objects inserted into their rectums, and on various occasions, some of these victims would have glass rods inserted into their penises, and then have a blunt force object smashed over their penis so the glass rod would break inside them. The next following day, around noon, the police and the inmates and Henley would all arrive at storage shed number 11.